Hello and welcome to Lecture 5 of Persecution and Anthropology of Witch Hunts. And this week the lecture is entitled Contemporary Witches, the Modernity of Witchcraft Idea. I'm your lecturer, Dr Nick Herriman, anthropologist at Trobe University. In the previous lecture, we considered anthropological explanations for magic. In particular, we looked at several possibilities. One such possibility is that magic may be a vestige of past beliefs and practices, that is, a survival. Magic may also function to maintain the individual or society. It may, in this sense, be, according to a functionalist explanation, may help people get on with each other and survive. Magic may also provide explanations for problems of meaning in life, that is, provide a theodicy. It may also need to be analysed and thickly described in the way that Geertz does in his interpretive anthropology or symbolic anthropology. And it may only be effective, like Western medicine, when it occurs within a structure, as argued in Levi-Strauss's structuralism. Sorcery and witchcraft, in particular, may occur along fault lines in a society, such as between mother-in-law and son-in-law, or to take a real case from Mornington Island, between classificatory brothers who either use sorcery against each other or accuse each other of using sorcery. So in Lecture 4, we started off with Fraser's idea of survivals, that societies develop from magical to religious to scientific beliefs, and even in scientifically dominated societies, magic beliefs might survive. This forms part of a larger idea, the idea of this progression from magical to religious to scientific beliefs. This forms part of a larger idea that with increasing modernization of the world, magic and religion would decline. Most scholars, however, now argue that what we have seen instead in the past half century is a growth of religion and magic, a growth. To explain this, scholars have developed ideas that we'll analyse in this lecture. The religious resurgence idea and the modernity of witchcraft idea both hold that as the world modernizes, religion and magic become more significant. To start with, we need to know what we mean by modernity. Following Weber and Durkheim, the classical definition of modernity is based around instrumental rationality. This basically means that modern people use rational means to obtain rational goals. So to get a good harvest, instead of praying to God or using a magical spell, I use a combine harvester. As a rational means to a rational goal. Into the 1950s and 60s, anthropologists studying development elaborated this idea. They characterized modernity as involving industrialization, urbanization, new forms of social organization, such as unions, mass organizations, and nations, a complex or risk society with highly specialized and independent roles for different people. Social differentiations of society into different spheres, such as an economic sphere, political sphere, and religious sphere. Occupations as professions, as opposed to informal arrangements. So I become a lecturer only after I have gone through certain formal procedural steps. In the Middle Ages, I might just become a professor because I wore a cloak and somebody liked me. Bureaucratic rule, in other words, we are ruled not by the king and his wardrobe, or the lord, or the warlord, or whatever it is, but rather by an organisation that functions according to bureaucratic rules. A capitalist economy, that is an economy based around commodities. Individualism, liberal democracy, science and technology, very importantly, and finally secularization. Okay, so that secularization here is part of the idea of modernity. Now that was into the 50s and 60s. Anthropologists used those ideas. However, since about the 1970s, anthropologists have increasingly come to see this idea of modernity as really the Western experience of modernity, not the universal experience of modernity. In other words, it sets up the West as a paragon of modernity and the West as languishing behind. In other words, Taiwan is more modern than Tanzania in this conception, or the USA is more modern than Uzbekistan. But anthropologists have critiqued this notion. They say we cannot see the West as the destiny for the rest of the world. It's not like Tanzania or Uzbekistan have to follow the same path of France and the UK. Hence, to provide a more global perspective, anthropologists have proposed that different societies have their own valid experience and understanding of modernity. One way to conceptualize this has been to pluralize modernity so that there are many modernities in the contemporary world. There is, for example, an Asian modernity, an African modernity, or even a Taiwanese modernity and a Tanzanian modernity. Or we could argue that there is a single modernity that belongs to all countries, the West as much as the rest, and the rest have responded critically to this modernity as much as the West has. Either way we want to look at it, a single modernity or plural modernities, we have to seriously consider the way all societies have understood and experienced modernity as anthropologists. So the basis of this criticism was that modernity had been understood as a Western experience. Another criticism that anthropologists have levelled against the idea of modernity relates to secularization. In particular, they have argued that in the West and elsewhere, secularization has not occurred as predicted. In fact, in many places around the world, people interpret and understand the experience of modernity using religion and magic. Okay, so now I want to talk about new religious movements and the religious resurgence. In the past century, a variety of new religions, faiths, or worldviews have emerged throughout the world. Famous examples in the West include Hare Krishna, Reverend Sun Moon's Unification Church, Scientology, and so on. To describe these and other such examples, scholars often use the term NRM, or New Religious Movement. These NRMs are held in contrast to the traditional religions, by which we refer to things such as Islam, Hinduism, and Christianities. Okay, so one of the new religious movements that we refer to is the New Age. The New Age developed in the West from about the 1930s, and you can see it now in New Age bookshops, New Age, where you can buy crystals and so on. The movement is highly individualized and very amorphous and unclear, but one of the basic principles is that each New Age pilgrim has his or her own spiritual journey. Because everybody's got their own journey, it's difficult to generalize, but hopefully not impossible. One characteristic, though, is the movement has a commitment to monism, the idea that all is one. This stands in contrast to dualism, which holds that mind and matter are separate. So New Agers see no distinction between the mental and physical aspect of a person. The New Age is ecumenical. New Agers tend to believe that all religions have one truth and we can borrow from different religions. The differences between the religion can be reconciled, in other words. This allows the seekers, the pilgrims that is, to fish from different traditions. More recently, it has been held that the New Age can be reconciled with ecology and post-Newtonian physics. And this was depicted, for example, in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? New Agers thus strive for a new belief system which addresses this truth of physics, of ecology, of the mind-matter union. So that's the New Age. A related development in recent Western religion is neo-paganism. Anthropologist Jansen explains, neo-paganism refers to the revival of pre-Christian pagan gods, goddesses and spirits, and their worship and ritual manipulation. It also refers to an animistic sense of spiritual power and reverence for nature. Neo-pagans focus much of their spiritual practice upon practical results, the ability to affect their environment through magical means. So we could use this term neo-paganism to incorporate various informal movements such as paganism, Druidism and Celtic paganism. So we've looked at the new religious movements in general and neo-paganism specifically. Now, possibly we could subsume within this category of neo-paganism Wicca. Wicca is often described as the modern witchcraft religion. It could be considered as a neo-pagan movement in that it tries to revive pre-Christian beliefs and practices. However, the Wicca movement is eclectic, more recently joining with sci-fi and fantasy groups and also tying in with feminist and LGBTI, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual and intersex outlooks. The movement possesses no bureaucracy or orthodoxy. Its adherents sometimes form covens in which they are known as priestesses and priests. They perform rituals to a number of deities, but most important among these are the mother goddess and the horned god. Okay, so the Wicca movement is relevant to our study in the anthropology of witch hunts in three ways. First, it's an example of an NRM and the religious resurgence. Second, some of its adherents possess a specific theory about the Great Witch Hunt, which we have to address. And thirdly, adherents self-identify as witches. Okay, so let's look at the first thing about Wicca and the religious resurgence. In other words, Wicca as an example of the religious resurgence. The term religious resurgence refers to the rise of religious beliefs worldwide, particularly from around the 1970s. This can be seen on the one hand in the growth of NRMs, new religious movements. On the other hand, it can also be seen in the revivalist movements within traditional religions. So within traditional religions, there are calls for the faithful to be more observant. The one classic example is the Da'wah, which has been a movement within Islamic countries to bring people back to the faith as it is seen. So within this religious resurgence, Wicca has an important place in the West. To give some indication of the number of adherents, in the 2001 New Zealand census, there were 2,000 Wiccans. A census from the same year found 11,000 pagans and 9,000 Wiccans in Australia. A UK census in 2001 found 31,000 pagans and 7,000 Wiccans. Precise data from the USA is not available for that year, but on the basis of a survey of 50,000, it was estimated that there are about 140,000 pagans and 134,000 Wiccans. So what do we know about these adherents? According to the academic Berger, Wicca constitutes for the most part a religion of well-educated middle-class Westerners. Its adherents share ideas at festivals and bookshops, through computer networks and in magazines and books. So Wiccans have a theory about the Great Witch Hunt. They tend to believe that they practice the same religion as the victims of the Great Witch Hunt. In other words, searching for pre-Christians' beliefs and practices, neo-pagans and Wiccans tend to use a number of classic texts authored by various historians and anthropologists and folklorists. One of these is the French historian Jules Michelet and his 1863 work, Satanism and Witchcraft, a Study in Medieval Religion. This book argued that the victims of the Great Witch Hunt had practiced a secret paganistic religion. Following this idea, Margaret Murray, who was Associate Professor of Egyptology at the University College of London, proposed in her Witch Cult in Western Europe, published 1921, that, quotes, witches were members of a huge secret society preserving a prehistoric fertility cult through the centuries. So to recap, the basic idea here is that the victims of the Great Witch Hunt were people who practiced the same religion as modern Wiccans. Now, the idea, which is sometimes called the witch cult hypothesis, has been severely criticised by academics both during the period when Murray was writing and now. Simpson maintains that Murray, quotes, is one of the few folklorists whose name became widely known to the public, but among scholars her reputation is deservedly low. Her theory is now seen to be based on deeply flawed methods and illogical arguments. The fact that she was made president of the Folklore Society must certainly have harmed the reputation of the society and possibly the status of folklore studies. In brief, contemporary academic standards contradict this hypothesis. Contemporary academic standards hold that the victims of the Great Witch Hunt were not people who maintained a pre-Christian religion. Okay, that's the second reason why Wicca was relevant to our unit, because the Wiccans have a theory regarding the Great Witch Hunt. The third reason why Wicca is relevant to our unit is that its adherents self-identify as witches. There are many people in the West who would call themselves witches. These followers of the witchcraft religion of Wicca practice magic. Now, to understand this, we need to find more detail on Wicca beliefs and practices. And the writings of the prominent Wiccan writer Starhawk are as good a place to start as any. As she explains, Wicca is a religion of the great goddess. Its origins lie with Europe's early hunters who, at the onset of the last ice age, worshipped the mother goddess and the horned god for success in the hunt. After the ice retreated, covens were formed. Barefoot princesses were pushed out by the Indo-Europeans with their warrior gods. These princesses went off to the mountains and became fairies who preserved the old religion. In witchcraft, nature does not hide the divine. Nature is suffused with it. The religion is not a mass religion. It's based on covens of up to 13 members. They try to create a union with the divine and healings. In each ritual, a temple is created and ecstasy is felt. And everybody who is initiated by the coven is a priest or a princess. Now, the understanding of magic is based on the concept of the universe as an ordered web, according to Berger. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you is the principle. In other words, magic is supposed to return to the sender threefold. So if you send black magic, you should suffer 3 times as much as your victims. So these priests and priestesses believe they practice witchcraft. However, contrary to the Western idea of witch, they do not the older Western idea of witch, they do not worship Satan, and nor do they allegedly practice black magic, because this is usually discouraged within Wicca. So they might self-identify as witches, they might call themselves witches, but from an outsider or an academic's perspective, the term for Wicca is probably closer, I mean, religion is probably a better term to describe, or more appropriate term to describe Wicca than witchcraft. In other words, Wiccan practitioners might call themselves witches, but from an academic perspective, from an outsider perspective, it's difficult to maintain that. And we expect this with most religions. Not much of academia supports the tenets of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. But that's a different matter. Okay. We've covered several points in looking at the modern witchcraft religion known as Wicca. Firstly, it could be situated as an NRM and part of the religious resurgence. Second, some Wiccan adherents have a theory that those victimized in the Great Witch Hunt practiced a pre-Christian religion. This theory is rejected by most contemporary academics, though. Third, although Wiccans identify as witches, they are different to the anthropological category of witch. So really, this was just one example of the rise of religion that contradicts the idea of secularization. The other phenomenon I wish to look at is the rise of magic. So we now want to look at what is called the modernity of witchcraft idea. Indeed, the preeminent anthropological studies of witchcraft in the 1980s and 1990s argued for what could be called the modernity of witchcraft. This is the idea that spirits, witches and sorcerers using supernatural powers for their own gain and the suffering that they create provides an accurate idiom or way of understanding the machinations of capitalism and modernity. In his widely admired paper, The Genesis of Capitalism Amongst the South American Peasantry, Taussig analyzes the development of capitalism and the dispossession of land in Colombia in terms of harmful magic and evil spirits. The peasants of Chaucha Valley understand the functioning of capital as, among other things, the work of the devil. These peasants commonly think they can baptize money so that it becomes interest-bearing capital. In other words, you ask me to stand as godfather for your daughter. I agree. I slip a $10 note up my sleeve. When the priest comes to baptize your daughter, she misses out on the baptism and is therefore condemned to hell. However, my $10 note gets baptized and suddenly becomes very productive. This illicit use of magic explains the growth of capital. In other words, how money creates money. And it contrasts the idea which one might find, for example, in the New York Times or the Financial Times, that the growth of capital is a natural quality of money in itself. Peasants also think they can increase their labor output through a contract with the devil. A contract with the devil we could also call a diabolical pact. If one makes a diabolical pact, the wages one receives are infertile. They do not grow. They must be spent immediately, but not on productive capital. So Colombian peasants' occult belief thus provide a critical idiom or critical way for understanding capitalism, according to Taussig. According to Taussig, they see capitalism as it actually is, neither good nor self-evident, but rather unnatural, unreal, supernatural, evil, and immoral. You might guess that Tausig isn't a big fan of capitalism. In other words, capitalism increases through devious and destructive means. So witchcraft, being similarly insidious, provides a perfect way to understand the workings of capitalism. Another author, Geshe, holds that the invisible movement of capital across borders and around the world is aptly or well expressed in the movement of witches flying around the globe, causing evil. Similarly, Geshe offers a counterpoint to the grand evolutionary theories of secularization, maintaining that people interpret modern processes of change in terms of witchcraft. So, far from being traditional, witchcraft discourses fuse the local with the global. Geshe also asserts that witchcraft is closely associated with new forms of wealth and modernity. The Komarovs are other anthropologists who have dealt with this problem. They critique the idea of the secularization idea that as the world modernizes, magic beliefs and ritual decline. Rather, ritual and magic, they assert, are creative, transformative, and subversive, not on the decline at all. Witchcraft beliefs in particular have been strengthened by the introduction of market economies and, according to the Komarovs, embody all the contradictions of the experience of modernity itself. Finally, Aihwa Ong has argued that evil spirits contextualize the experience of capitalism for Malay female factory workers. So in other words, she's talking about the industrialization that is associated with modernity. She maintains that the spirit possession is, quotes, a protest against the loss of humanity as a result of working in a factory. So in this way, various authors have argued that witchcraft and evil spirits contextualize the experience of capitalism and modernity. In other words, to give you some more example, this time again from Geshe, someone who obtains riches through capitalist markets is often presumed to have used witchcraft. Maybe they stole somebody's soul. They stole their relatives' souls and forced their relatives to work on zombie plantations. And this provides an accurate understanding or a relevant understanding for the way capitalism and modernity affects the lives of these people. So the modernity of witchcraft research has stressed the importance of global flows and capital in understanding magic. And to the extent that the mundane has been affected by global flows and capitalism, this research provides a valuable corrective to the older idea that magic is merely traditional. But at the same time, and this is my critique, privileging globalization, modernization, and capitalism as a way to approach magic risks overlooking the local nature of magical beliefs and practices, which I'll return to throughout this unit. But to take one example from a previous article I wrote in 2009, I demonstrated that sorcery and witchcraft in Banyuwangi, where I do field work, has what I call in-group manifestation. That is, it affects friends, neighbours and family, people within the group. In contrast to the predominant approach to witchcraft, I argued that the distinction between capitalist economy and, if you like, traditional or reciprocal economy is still useful, that analyses on the local aspect of witchcraft tensions are just as pertinent as looking at the international. And in fact, I attribute sorcery between friends, neighbours and family to relations, everyday relations of give and take, not so much capitalism. There are other reasons for which we might critique this modernity of witchcraft idea. Richard Sutcliffe recently argued that rationality and occult beliefs are different sides of the same coin. He suggests that modern Western conceptions of magic often employ a neo-evolutionary concept whereby logic and reason rightly replaced magic. I mean, we saw this in Fraser, for example. But the idea that modernity is wholly secular and rational is a myth. Rather than declining, magic is continually recreated in modernity. Reason and occult thus constitute modern thought in equal measure. In these first 5 lectures, I provided a backdrop to the anthropological study of witch hunts. After introducing the course in Lecture 1, in Lecture 2 I outlined the anthropological approach and methodology that will be used in this course. Lecture 3 provided a basic understanding of religion and magic. In Lecture 4, I looked at different ways in which anthropologists have understood magic. In this lecture, I've analysed the idea that religion and magic may be on the rise. This is important to the study of witch hunts because it shows that it is not an issue of the past. Rather, as mentioned before, witch hunts are a pressing contemporary issue. Now we've covered all this background, we're ready to look at witch hunts proper. I look forward to your company for that.